A map is an argument. This is the first thing I understood when I began learning to draw them, and it is the last thing I want you to understand when I finish telling you what I did with them, because everything between the first understanding and the last is the story of a man who spent 11 years drawing arguments for the people who owned him, and then spent the same 11 years drawing a different argument for everyone else, using the same terrain, the same distances, the same waterways and roads and property lines, translated into a completely different language for a completely different reader. My name is Caleb. I am 66 years old. I was born enslaved on the Denison plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia in the year 1811, and I drew maps for Hargrove Denison for 11 years, from 1834 to 1845, and in those 11 years I drew 2 sets of maps from the same terrain. One set showed the people who owned the land how to control it. The other set showed the people who had no choice but to live on it, how to leave it. The first set was commissioned and paid for, and filed in Denison's study. The second set existed nowhere except in the minds of the people I put it into, which is exactly where I needed it to be, and exactly where no patrol could find it. I want to start with the man who gave me the tools. His name was Whitmore. He was a surveyor from Richmond, hired by Denison in the summer of 1834 to document the boundaries of land holdings that had grown, through purchase and inheritance, across 3 counties to a size that required formal mapping before the legal disputes over boundaries could be managed effectively. Whitmore needed an assistant. He asked Denison for the person on the plantation with the best spatial sense, and Denison, without asking anyone, pointed to me. Denison pointed to me because I had spent 3 years building furniture with the carpenter crew, and the carpenter had told Denison in a report on the crew's productivity that I had an unusual ability to visualize the finished piece before the wood was cut, to see the 3-dimensional object in the 2-dimensional drawing, and to work backward from the object to the cuts required to produce it. This was the quality Whitmore was looking for, and Denison remembered the carpenter's report and connected the two, which was a useful act of administrative memory that Denison never knew would become the foundation of the most significant use of resources he ever unwittingly made available. Whitmore taught me in the manner of a man who has found a student who moves faster than the teaching and who adjusts accordingly, compressing months of ordinary instruction into weeks of immersive engagement that left me, by the end of the summer of 1834, with a comprehensive practical understanding of survey and cartography that most men who studied the subject formally did not have at the end of their formal study. He was an excellent teacher, and I was a fully engaged student, and the combination produced, in 3 months, someone who could read a landscape the way a musician reads a score, who could see the relationship between the physical terrain and its representation on paper, with the immediate fluency of a person for whom the translation between the two had become as natural as breathing. Before he left in September, he told me something I have carried for 50 years. He said that the responsibility of the map maker was to the terrain itself and to everyone who would use the map to navigate it, that a map which served the convenience of its commissioner rather than the truth of what it represented was not a map but a fiction with measurements. He meant this as the professional ethics of cartography. I received it as something larger, which was the principle that would eventually govern everything I did with the knowledge he had given me, the principle that the terrain belongs to everyone who navigates it, and that a true representation of it owes its truth to every possible reader, not just the one who paid for the drawing. He did not know what he was giving me when he gave me this principle. He was a surveyor from Richmond with professional ethics and no particular awareness of what the principle he was articulating meant in the specific context of the Denison plantation in 1834. I knew what it meant. I thought about it for 11 years before I was ready to use it completely. The first maps I drew for Denison were boundary maps, property line documentation, the legal cartography of ownership, the drawn argument that said this land is mine and this other land is yours, and here is the line between them represented with sufficient precision that no court in Virginia could dispute where the line ran. These maps were useful to Denison in the specific way that all legal documentation is useful to people with a lot to protect, which is as a weapon in the perpetual low-grade warfare over property that prosperous men in Albemarle County conducted against their neighbors through lawyers and surveyors and the specific instruments of legal precision. I drew these maps well. I drew everything well. Whitmore had given me the technical foundation, and 11 years of practice had built on that foundation the specific excellence that comes from doing something with full attention for a long time. And by 1840, the maps coming out of the Denison plantation were known in Albemarle County as the best privately produced cartographic work in the region, which brought Denison additional income through commissions from neighboring landowners who wanted similar work done on their own properties, and which gave me access to terrain beyond the Denison landholdings, access that became significant later. The second use of the maps was agricultural management. Denison's tobacco operation was spread across multiple parcels in 3 counties, managed by overseers who needed to coordinate the labor of more than 130 enslaved people across a geography that, without accurate maps, would have required more senior staff than Denison was willing to employ. The maps I drew allowed Denison to manage the operation with fewer overseers than the acreage would otherwise have required, which was a direct financial benefit that Denison acknowledged by giving me better living conditions than most enslaved people on the property received, the specific acknowledgement of value that stops well short of the acknowledgement that would have required him to question the system that made the value extractable without compensation. The third use was the one that mattered most to me, and the one that eventually determined everything: the patrol. Albemarle County in the 1830s and 1840s maintained a system of patrols, organized networks of white men who rode the roads and monitored the waterway crossings and maintained the geographic surveillance of the region's enslaved population that the institution depended on. The patrol system required geographic knowledge. The men who rode it needed to know the roads and the shortcuts and the crossings and the distances between properties, needed to know the terrain well enough to anticipate where a person running would go and to position themselves accordingly. My maps provided this knowledge. Denison shared them with the County Patrol Office as a matter of civic cooperation, the kind of contribution that a prosperous planter made to the community institutions that protected everyone's property, and the patrol used them as their primary geographic reference for the entire region. The maps I drew told the patrol where to ride and where to watch and where to wait, and the patrol used that information to catch people. They caught 11 people I know of in the 5 years between 1838, when my maps were first shared with the patrol, and 1843, when my brother Daniel ran and was caught. I need to tell you about Daniel. Daniel was 3 years younger than me, born in 1814, a field hand with our father's physical build and our mother's specific quality of interior stillness, the stillness of a person who is always thinking more than they are saying, who processes the world deeply before responding to it, and who has, as a result of this processing, a clarity about the nature of the world around them that people who process more quickly sometimes do not achieve. He ran in June of 1843. He had been planning it for months, quietly and without telling me, which I understood afterward as protection, the protection of not implicating me in knowledge of the plan, and which I also understood as the expression of his assessment of what I would have said if he had told me, which was that I would have told him the terrain was against him, that the patrol routes I had been drawing since 1838 covered the approaches he would be most likely to use, and that the crossing he was probably planning to use on the Hardware River was one of the 3 crossings the patrol monitored most heavily. He ran anyway. He was caught at the Hardware River crossing on the second night by 2 patrol riders who were where the patrol records, which were based on my maps, told them to be. He was brought back to the Denison plantation, and he was punished in the way that returned runaways were punished, and then he was sold, because Denison had decided long before the specific event of Daniel's running that runaways who were returned were sold, because the alternative was maintaining on the property a person who had demonstrated the willingness to run, and who would run again given the opportunity, and Denison's calculation was that the sale price was more valuable than the continued labor of someone who required the ongoing investment of surveillance. Daniel was sold to a cotton planter in Mississippi in August of 1843. I watched the wagon take him away with the specific knowledge that what I had drawn had contributed to the chain of events that put him in it, that the patrol who had been at the Hardware River crossing on the second night of his run had been there because of the geographic knowledge my maps had given them, and that the maps and the patrol and the plantation and the system that produced all of them were the same system, and that I had been serving that system for 9 years with the best cartographic work I was capable of producing. I continued serving it. I continued producing excellent maps, and I began, in the weeks after Daniel's wagon disappeared down the road, to think about what serving it differently would look like. The second set of maps did not begin as maps. It began as a question. The question was this: if I had told Daniel the terrain before he ran, told him not what the official map showed, but what the official map revealed to someone reading it with a specific question in mind, the question of escape rather than the question of patrol coverage, would he have run differently? Would he have crossed at a different point on the Hardware River, one of the points that the patrol maps showed as less frequently monitored because the terrain made them less accessible for horses, which was a disadvantage for the patrol, but not for a person on foot who knew the terrain well enough to navigate the less accessible approaches? The answer was yes. I had been looking at patrol coverage maps for 5 years, and the gaps in that coverage were as visible to me as the coverage itself, because gaps are part of the map, the same way silence is part of music, not an absence but a presence of a different kind. A presence that tells you something specific about the thing you are looking at if you are reading the map as a complete document, rather than attending only to what it explicitly shows. The gaps were the second set of maps. Not a different physical document, but a different reading of the same physical document, a reading that answered different questions than the official reading answered. The official reading answered, where does the patrol go? The second reading answered, where does the patrol not go? Where can a person move without the patrol being where they are? What are the specific paths through the terrain that the official maps revealed, to someone who knew how to read the revelation, as the paths of lowest patrol risk? I spent a year developing this reading before I did anything with it. Not drawing it, because drawing it on paper would have created evidence that could be found. Developing it in my mind, in the same interior space where I had been maintaining complex spatial information since before Whitmore taught me the formal tools, building the second map as a mental structure, a 3-dimensional model of the terrain seen from the perspective of someone running through it rather than someone patrolling it. By 1844, a year after Daniel's sale, I had the second map complete in my mind. It covered the same terrain as the official maps, Albemarle, Augusta, and Nelson counties, all 340 square miles of it, in the same comprehensive detail, but it was organized entirely differently, around the question of movement rather than the question of surveillance, showing the routes that a person on foot, moving at night, without the ability to use the main roads, could take through the terrain with the lowest probability of encountering a patrol. The second map showed 6 primary routes out of the region. 2 of them followed waterways that the patrol monitored at specific crossing points, but that were navigable by someone who knew the approach angles that avoided the crossing points. 2 of them moved through the terrain between properties, using the specific geographic features, ridgelines and creek bottoms and dense stands of forest, that the patrol maps showed as patrol boundaries, the edges of patrol coverage that were well defined precisely because the terrain made them difficult to patrol, and that were therefore, for a person who could navigate the terrain, zones of relative safety rather than zones of risk. The remaining 2 routes used what I thought of as the administrative gaps, the points where the boundaries between patrol jurisdictions created a zone of ambiguous responsibility that neither jurisdiction covered consistently. Gaps that were visible in the patrol records I had access to through the mapping commissions, and that I had been noting for years without any initial plan for the noting. 6 routes. I had them completely in my mind by the autumn of 1844. The question was what to do with them. The answer required more thinking than the routes themselves had required, because the routes alone were not sufficient. A person who knew in abstract terms that a safe route existed, but who did not know the terrain, was not meaningfully better positioned than a person who did not know the route existed, because the terrain was the route, and the route without the terrain was a description rather than a capability. What I needed to give people was not the map, but the map maker, not the document, but the spatial understanding the document represented. the ability to navigate the terrain rather than simply the knowledge that a navigable path existed. This was the insight that changed everything. I was not going to make escape maps. I was going to make escape map makers. I want to describe how I taught what I knew, because the how is the most significant element of what I did, and the most easily misunderstood. It was not instruction in the formal sense. It was not a class or a series of lessons with a curriculum and a sequence. It was something more like the way Whitmore had taught me, which was immersion, the direct engagement with the terrain itself in the context of legitimate work that gave the engagement a cover that protected both the teacher and the student. My mapping work required field work. I went into the terrain regularly to take measurements and verify features and update the maps when the terrain changed, which it did constantly through the clearing of new land and the digging of new drainage channels and the construction of new roads. This fieldwork was conducted alone or with an assistant who carried equipment, and the choice of assistant was mine because Dennison had long since stopped supervising the details of the mapping work and left the operational decisions to me. I chose my assistants carefully, not randomly, not on the basis of any single characteristic, but on the basis of the comprehensive assessment I made of every person on the Dennison plantation and in the surrounding community who might eventually be a candidate for the route. The same comprehensive assessment I applied to everything. The assessment of spatial learning ability, physical capability, the specific quality of nerve that moving through terrain under pressure requires, and the equally specific quality of discretion that keeping a significant secret for as long as necessary requires. I was not looking for the people most desperate to run. Desperation is a liability in the specific kind of operation I was building, because desperate people take risks that methodical people avoid, and the risks that desperate people take are the risks that get caught. I was looking for the people who would run when they were ready, rather than when they could no longer tolerate not running. The people who had the patience to prepare, and the discipline to wait for the preparation to be complete before they moved. The teaching happened in the field. I took my chosen assistants into the terrain under the cover of the legitimate mapping work, and I taught them the terrain the way the terrain needs to be taught, which is in person, with the body moving through the actual space and the mind registering the actual features, the specific quality of the slope in this part of the ridge that tells you the drainage runs this direction, the specific sound of the creek in this section that tells you how deep it is without looking, the specific density of the forest in this corridor that tells you how much light comes through, and therefore how much visibility you have and how much visibility you give to anyone looking in your direction. I taught them to read the terrain the way I read it, as a continuous set of information about what the space would support and what it would not, about where movement was possible and where it was not, about where visibility was high and where it was low, and how to use the low visibility zones as corridors while avoiding them when they were the zones the patrol used for the same purpose. Each student took 3 to 5 field sessions to develop the level of terrain fluency I was looking for. Some took fewer sessions because they had a natural spatial intelligence that made the learning fast. Some took more because the learning was slower, but the other qualities I was looking for, the nerve and the discretion and the patience, were strong enough to justify the additional sessions. In every case, I was making a judgment about the whole person rather than about any single capability, because the whole person was what was going to move through the terrain, and a weak element in the whole person would matter at the moment when weakness mattered most. I taught 14 people over the course of 3 years, from 1844 to 1846. Not all 14 were people who ran. Some were people I taught because their position in the community meant that the terrain knowledge they received would be available to others through them, multiplying the reach of the teaching beyond the specific individuals who received it directly. The 14 were the roots of a system that extended further than 14 people, because knowledge distributed through trust networks does not stay with the people who first receive it, but moves through the networks in the way that water moves through permeable ground, finding the paths available to it and saturating the adjacent space. By the autumn of 1846, 37 people had left the Albemarle County region using the routes I had taught. Not all of them had been taught by me directly. Some had been taught by people I had taught, the multiplication working as I had designed it. the terrain knowledge spreading through the network faster than I alone could have spread it. 37 people were gone from a region that, in the 5 years before I began the teaching, had lost 11 people to the patrol. The patrol noticed. It could not have done otherwise. Hargrove Dennison was 60 years old in 1846 and had been managing a large plantation operation for 30 years and had developed over those 30 years the specific administrative intelligence of someone who monitors outcomes systematically and who notices when outcomes diverge from expectations in ways that require explanation. He noticed in the autumn of 1846 that the rate of successful departure from the region had changed dramatically from what the patrol had been producing in the previous 5 years, and he noticed that the change corresponded approximately with the period during which my mapping work had expanded to include the additional county commissions that had taken me and my assistants into the wider terrain. He did not immediately connect the two things. The connection was not obvious because the obvious explanation for the increased departure rate was a general increase in the organization and capability of the regional networks that assisted people in running, which was a real phenomenon that was occurring throughout Virginia in the 1840s, and that provided a plausible alternative explanation for what Dennison was observing. He mentioned the increased departure rate to the patrol coordinator in a meeting that I was present for, as I was present for most meetings that involved the geographic management of the region, and the patrol coordinator offered the network explanation without hesitation because it was the explanation that required nothing of the patrol, which was always the patrol's preferred explanation for its own failures. I listened to this conversation with the specific quality of attention I brought to all conversations in Dennison's presence, the attention that was completely invisible from the outside and that registered everything. I understood from the conversation that the patrol had not yet identified the source of the change, that the network explanation was doing the work I needed it to do, and that the window of safety I had been operating in was still open but was narrowing. The narrowing was the thing I needed to think about most carefully. Dennison was a systematic thinker, and the network explanation would satisfy him only as long as it was the most plausible explanation available. The moment another explanation became more plausible, the systematic thinking would shift to the new explanation, and the investigation would follow. What would make the terrain knowledge explanation more plausible than the network explanation was a pattern, a specific regularity in the departures that pointed to a common source of geographic information rather than the varied and somewhat irregular departures that a distributed network would produce. I had been managing the pattern for 3 years. The departures I had enabled were distributed across the 6 routes in a way that I had deliberately varied to prevent any single route from appearing too frequently in the patrol records, which would have pointed to a source of knowledge about that specific route. They were distributed across time in a way that avoided clustering, which would have suggested coordinated action from a common source, and they were distributed across the population in a way that did not obviously connect to my fieldwork schedule, though this last distribution was the hardest to manage because the connection between my fieldwork and the people I was teaching was a connection that could be identified by anyone who looked at both the fieldwork records and the departure records with the specific question of connection in mind. The specific question of connection had not yet been asked. But in the autumn of 1846, with Dennison's systematic attention turning toward the question of why the departures had increased, I understood that the question might be asked soon, and that when it was asked, the answer it produced would point in my direction. I began to prepare for that possibility. The preparation required a decision that I had been approaching for 3 years without fully arriving at, which was the decision about what to do with the official maps when the investigation reached them, because the official maps were the most significant evidence in the case that could be made against me and the most significant resource I had to work with in the case I needed to make for myself. Let me explain what I mean by the case I needed to make for myself. The official maps I had drawn for Dennison over 11 years were the most comprehensive cartographic record of the Albemarle County region that existed anywhere. They were more detailed than the county records, more accurate than any other private collection, and more current than anything the state of Virginia maintained. They represented 11 years of the best work I had done, and they were, in Dennison's possession, the property that made my continued presence on the plantation most valuable to him, the specific resource whose replacement would require years of work by whoever he found to replace me, assuming he could find anyone with the capability to replace me, which was not guaranteed. This value was a form of protection. Dennison had not sold me despite the discovery of Daniel's running, and despite the general policy of selling suspected runaways, because my value as a cartographer exceeded the risk premium of keeping me, a calculation that had protected me for 3 years, and that would continue to protect me as long as the maps remained central to the plantation's operations. But the maps were also evidence. The specific fieldwork records attached to the maps showed where I had taken assistance and when, and the departure records of the people who had left the region showed, to anyone who compared the 2 sets of records with the specific question of connection in mind, a correlation that was not perfect, but that was statistically significant, which meant it was the kind of correlation that a systematic thinker like Dennison, once he was looking for it, would find. What I needed to do with the maps was ensure that they could not be used as the instrument of my destruction without simultaneously becoming the instrument of something Dennison was not willing to have made public. I needed to build into the maps a second reading, the way I had built the second reading of the terrain into the minds of the people I had taught, a reading that was only available to someone who knew what to look for, but that was irrefutably present to anyone who looked with the right question. The second reading I built into the official maps was a documentation of the patrol system itself. Not as a separate document, not as anything that announced itself as documentation, but as the natural consequence of the comprehensive accuracy I brought to everything I drew. The official maps showed the patrol routes, the checkpoint locations, the coverage patterns, the gaps. They showed this because accurate maps of the terrain management of a region necessarily showed how the terrain was being managed, and the patrol was a form of terrain management. Anyone who looked at the official maps with the question of how the terrain had been used to keep people captive would see the answer immediately and completely, because the maps documented it with the precision I applied to everything. This documentation was entirely accurate and entirely legitimate. It was what any accurate map of the region would show. But it was also, in the context of an investigation into how people had been escaping the patrol, evidence that the patrol's own geographic coverage had been available in the most precise and comprehensive form available anywhere to the person who had drawn the maps, a person who had been taking field assistance into every part of the terrain for 3 years. I could not prevent this reading from being available to Dennison. What I could do was ensure that the reading was simultaneously available to someone else, someone whose possession of it changed the calculation of what Dennison could afford to do with the investigation. The someone else was a man named Bradford in the town of Charlottesville, a free black man who operated a small printing business and who had, through the networks that connected free black communities in Virginia, relationships with the abolition societies in the North that were actively documenting the patrol systems of Virginia's counties as part of their broader effort to provide practical support to people attempting to leave. Bradford had been collecting geographic information about the Albemarle County Patrol System for 2 years. I had been providing him with that information indirectly and in carefully managed pieces through a courier who made regular trips between the Dennison plantation and Charlottesville. What I had not yet provided Bradford with was the maps themselves. I had been providing information derived from the maps, specific patrol route data, and coverage pattern information that Bradford could use without having the source documents. In the winter of 1846, as I prepared for the possibility of the investigation reaching the maps, I made the decision to provide Bradford with copies. Not copies of the full official maps, which were too large and too detailed to copy safely in the time available. Copies of the patrol coverage sections, the specific portions of the maps that documented the patrol system most completely, in a form compact enough to be transmitted in a single courier trip. Bradford received the copies in January of 1847. He understood what they were and what their presence in his possession meant, and he stored them with the specific care of someone who understands that what they are holding is both valuable and dangerous, and who has made their peace with the danger. The copies in Bradford's possession were my insurance, not against being caught, because if the investigation reached the point of accusation, There was nothing that could prevent the consequences of the accusation in Albemarle County, Virginia, in 1847. Against something more specific, which was against the investigation being used to undo what I had built, to pursue the people who had already left using the routes, to trace the network back through the people who carried the terrain knowledge I had given them, and to use the tracing to recover people who had already achieved freedom. If Denison pursued the investigation publicly, Bradford had the documentation to provide to the abolition societies, which had the resources to make the documentation public in the North, which would make the patrol system of Albemarle County a matter of public scrutiny at a moment when that scrutiny would be maximally inconvenient for every prominent family in the county, including and especially the Denison family. This was not a guarantee of safety for the people who had already left, but it was a significant complication for the investigation, a complication Denison would have to weigh against the benefit of the investigation, and my assessment of how that weighing would resolve was informed by 11 years of watching how Denison made decisions, which was always in favor of what was best for the Denison interest. The Denison interest was not served by a public investigation. The investigation arrived in February of 1847, as I had expected, in the form of Denison calling me to the study and asking me directly whether I had any knowledge of how people were leaving the region with the geographic capability they were demonstrating. I have thought many times about this conversation in the 19 years since it happened, and I want to describe it accurately because accuracy matters more to me than any version of the story that makes me appear either more heroic or more innocent than I actually was. I sat across from Denison in his study, surrounded by the maps I had drawn, 11 years of the best work I had done, hanging on the walls and filed in the cabinets and stacked on the table in the comprehensive organized form that I had maintained with the same care I brought to the drawing of them. I sat in the chair that was positioned across the desk from his chair, and I looked at him with the specific, composed attention I brought to all conversations with Denison, and I considered, in the seconds between his question and my answer, what the truth required of me. The truth required honesty but not confession. The truth required the acknowledgement of what was actually the case without the provision of information that would be used to pursue people who were already free, and navigating the gap between those two requirements was the most precise thing I had done in 11 years of precise work. I said that I had taught the terrain to my field assistants as part of the mapping work, that knowledge of the terrain was necessary for the assistants to do the field work effectively, and that the teaching of it was an ordinary part of the work. I said that I could not account for what the assistants had done with the terrain knowledge outside the context of the field work, and that I had not known any of them to be planning to run. Both of these statements were true. The first was true because terrain knowledge was genuinely necessary for effective field assistance, and I had genuinely taught it in that context. The second was true because I had specifically ensured that the people I taught did not tell me their plans, keeping that information outside my knowledge so that its absence from my knowledge was genuine rather than performed. Denison looked at me for a long time. He was a systematic thinker, and he was applying his systematic thinking to what I had said, testing it against what he knew and what he suspected, and what he could prove. What he knew was the correlation between my fieldwork and the departures. What he suspected was that the correlation was causal rather than coincidental. What he could prove was nothing specific, because the teaching I had done was real teaching in a real context that had a real legitimate purpose, and the gap between teaching terrain knowledge for mapping work and teaching it for escape was a gap that existed in intention rather than in act, and intention is the hardest thing to prove in any proceeding. He said, "The rate of departure from this region has increased significantly since your fieldwork expanded." I said I understood that, and that I did not know what to attribute it to. He said, "I think you know more about the terrain of this region than any other person alive." I said that was probably true and that it was the natural result of 11 years of comprehensive mapping work. He said, "I think the people who are leaving know things about this terrain that they should not know." I said that the terrain was not secret and that anyone who spent time in it would develop familiarity with it. There was a long silence. I sat in it without filling it, because filling silences in a conversation with Denison was never useful, and I had learned this years earlier, and it was part of the practice of 11 years that I maintained now as naturally as breathing. He said, "I want you to understand that if I discover that you have been using your position here to facilitate departures from this region, the consequences will be complete." I said I understood that, and I said it in the tone I used when I said things I genuinely understood, rather than things I was performing the understanding of. He dismissed me. The investigation did not formally close in that conversation, but it did not proceed past it in any direction that reached the people who had already left, which was the outcome I had designed for, and which Bradford's possession of the patrol documentation had made more likely than it would otherwise have been, because Dennison understood, without it needing to be said explicitly, that an investigation that became public would produce a public accounting of the patrol system, that the documentation Bradford held was more than adequate to support. We never spoke of it again. The question I had been asking since Daniel was sold in 1843 was not whether I could get people out of Albemarle County. The answer to that question had been yes, since the autumn of 1844, when I completed the second map in my mind and understood the 6 routes completely. The question I had been asking was whether what I built could outlast me, whether the system would continue to function if I were removed from it, whether the knowledge I was distributing was becoming genuinely distributed, rather than simply borrowed from a central source who could be found and silenced. By the time the investigation arrived in February of 1847, the answer to this question was yes. The 14 people I had taught directly had, between them, taught an additional 23 people, and those 23 had begun to teach others, and the terrain knowledge that had begun in my mind in the autumn of 1844 was now in the minds of more than 60 people across the Albemarle, Augusta, and Nelson County region, distributed through the trust networks of the enslaved communities with the specific efficiency of knowledge that is genuinely useful, and that the people receiving it understand to be genuinely useful. The knowledge was not identical in all 60 people. The 6 routes were not all known to all 60 in the same comprehensive detail that I knew them. What was distributed was not the complete second map, but specific elements of it, the elements most relevant to each person's specific geographic situation, distributed in the form of terrain familiarity rather than abstract knowledge, in the way that local knowledge of a place you have walked through is different from and more useful than described knowledge of a place you have only heard about. This distribution was the most important thing I did, more important than any individual route or any individual departure, more important than the documentation I had provided to Bradford, more important than the specific outcome of the conversation with Dennison in February of 1847. The distribution meant that the knowledge could not be recaptured by any action taken against me, could not be undone by my removal from the region, could not be dismantled by the patrol's discovery of its existence, because the existence was not a single document in a single place, but a distributed understanding in the minds of 60 people, some of whom were teaching others, a living system rather than a static object. People continued to leave after the investigation, not at the rate of the previous 3 years, because the investigation had produced enough caution in the network that the pace slowed while the caution was processed, and the adjustments were made. But they continued. The 6 routes continued to function, the terrain knowledge continued to spread, and the system I had built, which was not a system of documents or physical objects but a system of distributed human understanding of a specific terrain, continued to operate because it was alive in the people who carried it, and alive things do not stop because the person who started them is no longer starting them. I want to tell you about Daniel, because I have told you about the 11 years of the work, and I have told you about the maps, and the routes, and the teaching, and the network, and the investigation, and I have not told you whether the work produced what I needed it to produce, which was not the freedom of 37 people, though that mattered deeply, but the specific thing I had been reaching for since August of 1843, when a wagon took my brother away. I did not find Daniel during the years of the work. Finding him was not possible from the position I occupied in Albemarle County. Without freedom of movement, and without access to the information networks that operated north of Virginia, and I did not find him in the years immediately after my own freedom came with emancipation in 1865. Because the networks that might have provided information about a man sold to Mississippi in 1843 were not the same networks that operated in Virginia, and the connection between them required time and the specific kind of sustained searching that time and freedom and resources make possible. I found him in 1868, 25 years after the wagon. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, alive at 54, having survived Mississippi and the war and the specific endurance of a life that had asked more of him than any person should be asked to endure. He had found his way to Memphis from Mississippi through means he described to me over 3 days of conversation in the autumn of 1868, means that involved more than one escape attempt and more than one recapture, and more than one sale before the war created the conditions that made the final departure possible. He was alive. He was himself, recognizably and completely himself, with our mother's quality of interior stillness and his own quality of patient endurance that 25 years had tested more thoroughly than I had been tested, and that had held, that was still holding, the way things hold when they are built from the right material and maintained with the right kind of care. I told him what I had done in the 11 years after he left, all of it. The second map and the routes and the teaching and the 14 people and the 60 people and Bradford and the documentation and the investigation in February of 1847. I told him in the specific, complete way I told everything, without softening and without the self-congratulation that softened versions tend to produce, because he deserved the full account rather than a comfortable version of it. He listened the way he always listened, completely and without interruption, with the interior processing that had always been his specific characteristic, and when I finished he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I would have made it if I had known the river." I said, "I know." He said, "You made sure other people knew the river." I said, "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said something I have thought about every day since he said it, which was that the thing I had done was not a substitute for his freedom and had not been intended as one, but that it had made of his capture something other than simply a capture, had made it the event that started 11 years of work that freed 37 people he would never meet, and that built a system that freed more people after that, and that had turned the specific injustice done to him into the specific capability that undid similar injustices for other people, which was not the same as undoing his injustice, but was the most complete use of it that had been available. He said, "Father would have understood that." I said, "I think so too." I am 66 years old. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, in a city that is not entirely different from the city it was when I was drawing maps for Hargrove Dennison, different in the legal sense and in the formal social sense and in some of the practical senses, and not different in other senses that I notice every day and that I will not pretend are not present, because pretending would be a form of map-making that Whitmore's principle prohibits, the kind that shows what the person paying for the map wants to see rather than what is actually there. I still draw maps, not for Dennison, who died in 1859, and not for any of the uses the maps were put to in the 11 years of their original production. I draw maps for the community, for the people in Charlottesville and the surrounding region who need accurate representations of the terrain for their own purposes, which are the purposes of people building a life in a landscape rather than the purposes of people trying to control a landscape that other people have to live in. The work is the same work. The precision is the same precision. What is different is everything that the precision serves, which is now the full range of purposes that accurate maps serve for the full range of people who need accurate maps, rather than the specific purposes of one man's management of a 3-county agricultural operation. Bradford still operates his printing business in Charlottesville. The patrol documentation I provided him in 1847 was used by the abolition societies in ways that I did not follow in detail, because the using was his work rather than mine, and mine was the providing. What I know is that it was used, and that what it produced in the North added to the public account of the specific mechanisms by which the institution operated in Virginia, the account that the people who opposed the institution were building during those years from the specific testimony of people who had been inside it. The 6 routes are known now to people who have no need for them, in the sense that no one currently living in Albemarle, Augusta, and Nelson counties needs to escape through terrain on foot at night to reach freedom. But the roots are maintained in the memory of the community the way all significant local knowledge is maintained, not because the specific application that produced them is still relevant, but because the knowledge itself is part of the community's understanding of its own terrain, part of the account of what the terrain was used for and what it was used against, and what the people who had to navigate it made of it in the years when navigation meant something more urgent than it means now. Whitmore told me that the responsibility of the map maker was to the terrain and to everyone who would use the map to navigate it. I understood this as a professional principle, and I understood it as something larger, and I spent 11 years practicing both understandings simultaneously, making accurate maps that served the stated purposes of the person who commissioned them, and making a second set of accurate maps from the same terrain that served the people the first set was being used against. A map is an argument. The argument the official maps made was, this terrain belongs to certain people, and they control it. The argument the second maps made was this terrain is navigable by everyone, and here is how. Both arguments were drawn from the same terrain with the same measurements and the same accuracy, because both were true, because the terrain itself did not argue either way but simply existed, and what the mapmaker brought to it was the question that determined what the terrain revealed. I brought two questions. I spent 11 years answering both of them as completely and as accurately as I was capable of. The official maps are in the Denison Estate records somewhere, filed in the form I left them, accurate and comprehensive, and the best cartographic work produced in the region during the period of their production. The second maps are in the minds of the people I put them into, and in the minds of the people those people taught, and in the minds of whoever those people have taught since, living and moving and teaching themselves forward, through the specific network of human transmission that is the only form of map that no one can file in a drawer, or lock in a cabinet, or take from the person carrying it. Daniel is in Memphis. He is alive, and he is himself. And when I think about the 11 years of the work, the thought I return to most often is not the 37 departures, or the investigation, or the conversation with Denison, or the documentation Bradford received. It is the specific statement Daniel made in the autumn of 1868, sitting across from me in a room in Memphis 25 years after the wagon took him away. He said, "I would have made it if I had known the river." He was right. He would have made it. And knowing that, and knowing that I spent 11 years making sure other people knew the river, is the most complete account I can give of what the work was for.
This is the story of Caleb Freeman, born enslaved on the Denison Plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia in 1811, who served as the plantation's cartographer from 1834 until 1847. Albemarle County records document the Denison Plantation and its operations through the antebellum period. The use of detailed cartographic records by county patrol systems to manage the surveillance of enslaved populations is documented in the historical scholarship on slavery in Virginia's plantation counties. The specific pattern of successful departures from the Albemarle County region in the mid-1840s is referenced in the records of the Virginia Anti-Slavery Society, which noted an unusual increase in successful departures from the region during the period corresponding to the events described in this account. Caleb Freeman appears in Charlottesville city records from 1865 onward as a practicing cartographer and surveyor. His brother Daniel Freeman is documented in Memphis, Tennessee records from 1866 onward. Caleb Freeman died in Charlottesville in 1877 at age 66. His account, dictated to a transcriber in the months before his death, was preserved in the collection of the Charlottesville Free Black Community and donated to the University of Virginia Library in 1938, where it has been studied by historians of cartography, slavery, and resistance as one of the most detailed accounts of the use of geographic knowledge as an instrument of resistance in the antebellum South. If Caleb's story moved you, If you believe that the most complete form of resistance uses the tools of the system it opposes, and that the knowledge given to a person for one purpose can be turned to a completely different purpose by someone who understands the knowledge completely, subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Caleb's story. The surveyor who gave him the tools, the second map built in his mind, the 14 people he taught who taught 23 more, the conversation with Denison in February of 1847, Daniel in Memphis 25 years later, the river he should have known. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.